Someone once said that food without wine is like a day without sunshine, and I completely agree with that statement. Wine has been enjoyed with food for as long as wine has been around, which is thousands of years. In the ancient times, we know that wine was diluted with water, as this was deemed safer to drink than pure water. Naturally, this would be enjoyed alongside food and on its own. The main objective when pairing food with wine is to add to the dining experience by creating a more complex yet balanced sensory experience with food and wine. In this lesson, I will introduce the basics of food and wine pairing and give you guidelines on how to create pairings on your own. The guidelines in this lesson are exactly that. They are not rules that are set in stone, because remember, taste is subjective. So what works well for me might not necessarily work well for you. When pairing food and wine, I encourage you to have fun and let those creative juices flow. Welcome back to your professional diploma in wine appreciation. Here at Shaw, we aim to equip you with knowledge and practical skills that will help you reach your goals and dreams today. Today, in Lesson 5 of your professional diploma in wine appreciation, is all about the basics of food and wine pairing. My name is Julia Blaine. I'm a qualified winemaker with nearly a decade's experience in the wine industry, and it is my job to teach you all that I know about the wonderful world of wine. At the end of today's lesson, you will be familiar with the food and wine pairing terminology, and you'll be able to define what these terms mean. You'll be able to apply the basic principles of flavor pairing in food and wine. And lastly, you'll have a comprehensive grasp on the principles of flavors and how they can pair together. Over time, traditional food and wine pairings have been born and are wonderful to experience. It is important, however, to keep in mind that there are infinite combinations out there. Like I said earlier, taste is subjective, and I encourage you to continuously challenge the norms and the classics. Become inventive, step outside your comfort zone, and try something new. Many classic pairings have become defined over time due to the fact that certain regional cuisines and wine types are grown, made, and enjoyed together in a specific region. Italy and France are both good examples of cultures that rarely have food without wine. Before we get into the science and the art of pairing wine with food, first we need to understand why we pair wine with food. What is the objective? When wine and food are enjoyed together in a way that an entire new sensorial experience is created, I would call that success. The objective to pairing could be to create an elevated gastronomic experience, to enhance or complement certain flavors and aromas, to seek synergy and balance between the plate and the glass. If you have ever had that moment where you've built the perfect bite and paired it with the wine and it feels like angels start singing and you are teleported to a happy place, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. When pairing food and wine, the core principle to keep in mind is balance. Balance has been a theme throughout this course and really is a key word to keep in mind. Essentially, you would like to consider the complete profile of the wine and pair it with a dish that will interact with it synergistically. In pairing wine with food, the pairing can work in one or two broad ways. They can either be contrasting or congruent. In short, a contrasting pairing works because it creates balance between flavors that contrast each other. This pairing works based on the principle that the flavor and aroma profiles present in the food and wine bring balance to each other as they have these contrasting elements. Think about salty, buttered popcorn with a glass of Chardonnay. A good everyday example of a contrasting pairing that you maybe encounter on a daily basis is the combination of salt and pepper, or of sweet and sour. Congruent food and wine pairings work because the combined experience celebrates and amplify shared flavor components. A classic example of this is how beef works well with mushrooms, as they both have an umami profile. Congruent pairings work based on the principle that the flavor and aroma profile in the wine will amplify and enhance the flavor and aroma profile in the food because they share similarities. This is why a spicy, smoky, full-bodied syrah works very well with grilled meats with a little bit of char and spice. We know that when we are performing a sensory analysis on wine, we focus on measuring and evaluating the 5 following parameters: acidity, tannin, which includes astringency, alcohol, which can contribute towards the body and the weight, sweetness, and body. This includes length, texture, and mouthfeel of the wine. Now, when we are tasting food and analyzing it, there are 7 parameters that are taken into consideration. They are salt, acid, sweet, bitter, fat, spice or heat, meaning chili, and umami. From these 2 lists, we can see that acidity and sweetness are present in both. And with the knowledge that we have acquired thus far in this course, we can already make some groupings when it comes to wine. We can conclude that dry red wines are more astringent or bitter because of tannins. Dry white wines have a high acidity, and sweet wines will naturally be sweeter. These are 3 generalizations that we can use for a basis of working out pairings. Along with these basic tastes that we can use as guidelines when we are putting together pairings, one needs to consider the intensity and the weight of the wine as well as the meal. As a rule of thumb, light-bodied wines that have a delicate flavor and aroma profile should not be paired with foods that are very intense, as the wine will very easily be overpowered by the flavor and aroma profile of the food. The same applies for the opposite, meaning that full-bodied wines that are highly aromatic and rich on the palate will very easily smother or overwhelm food that has a delicate and light profile. Dishes that are rich could be delicate, and a pro tip here is to pair the wine with the sauce of the dish rather than the main ingredient. Would you say that you are a picky eater? Are you highly sensitive to bitter tastes? And do fatty, greasy, or sweet desserts just overwhelm your palate too much? If you have answered yes to any of these questions, you might be a super taster. So you might be wondering, what is a super taster? A super taster is someone who is a highly sensitive taster. So flavors of food taste much more intense to you than to normal tasters. Whether you are a super taster or not is entirely up to your taste buds. Your taste buds are located on your tongue and contain anywhere between 50 and 150 taste receptor cells. These cells sense flavor such as sweet, bitter, acid, salty, and umami, your 5 tastes. The amount of taste buds that you have on your tongue will determine whether or not you are a super taster. Super tasters often dislike bitter vegetables like broccoli or cabbage, as the bitter flavor is just way too intense. Researchers of taste have grouped tasters according to the number of taste buds that they have on their tongue into 3 tasting categories. They are non-tasters, which are about 25% of people, medium tasters, about 50%, and super tasters, which are about 25% of people. So how do you know if you are a super taster? Well, there's a super easy home test that you can do to see what tasting category you fall into. Here's what you need to do. Firstly, punch a standard notebook hole, into a piece of wax paper or plastic wrap. Put this piece of paper or plastic onto your tongue. Then count the amount of larger taste buds that you can see in the hole. Sometimes counting these taste buds can be a little tricky. So if you are having trouble seeing them, you can stain your tongue to make them easier to spot. You can either use blue dye or have a glass of red wine. Once you have counted how many taste buds you have within that designated area, you can then determine what kind of taster you are. If you have got more than 30 taste buds in that area, this means you are a super taster, meaning that flavors are very intense for you, including sweet, salty, greasy or fatty foods, but especially bitter. The sensitivity to bitterness is normally an indication that someone is a super taster. Although this category of tasters has the word super in it, being a super taster isn't always a superpower. Super tasters rarely enjoy bitter drinks, like beers or any red wines that have a very high tannin content. In your opinion, do you think a super taster is more likely to enjoy a Pinot Noir or a Cabernet Sauvignon? You can take this opportunity to type your answer into Morpheus below, and we'll get to the answer of this question a little bit later in this lesson. If you have counted between 50 and 30 taste buds, this means you are a medium taster. This means you don't really mind your green bitter veggies and are pretty much easy to please when it comes to flavor. Being a medium taster doesn't mean you don't taste bitter as well as a super taster. It just means that it is not completely unpleasant for you. It is something that you don't mind. Medium tasters are normally happy to experiment with flavors and often enjoy a large variety of flavor. If you have got less than 15 taste buds in the designated area, then you are a non-taster. Non-tasters often love spicy foods and can eat hot foods with lots of chili without even flinching. Non-tasters don't taste bitter in the same way as medium tasters or super tasters, and some non-tasters can actually not taste bitter at all. This means that your food and wine flavor experience is quite different, and oftentimes a wine that will be mouth-puckeringly tannic and foods that are very intense or spicy for others will be silky smooth and easygoing for you. No matter which tasting category you find yourself in, anyone is capable of being a great wine taster. We have learned that the majority of what you taste is actually happening retronasally, and that your nose is mostly responsible for it all. So allow me to give you some tips to becoming a better taster. Smell everything and add to the sensory memory bank. I mean, smell the lemon before you slice it. Open the pantry and familiarize yourself with all of the spices you have in there. And take a moment to smell your food before you eat it. Analyze the sensorial impact of the wine on your palate. Pay attention to the texture of the wine in terms of tannins and body and mouthfeel. Use your tools. Take time to think and pay attention to the process. Write your notes, use your flavor and aroma wheel that we've designed here for you at Shaw Academy, and practice tasting accurately and scoring the wine with your specialized wine scoring sheet. Did you know that we are all born with about 10,000 taste buds, and your body replaces them every 2 weeks? Now that we have introduced the basics, let's break it down, dive deeper, and look at some specifics. Acidity is perceived as freshness in wine, as well as the structure and that lovely refreshing zing that you get on the palate. In wine, we mainly discuss tartaric acid, malic acid, and lactic acid. So let's take a moment just to quickly recap on these acids. Your tartaric acid, being the main grape acid, is responsible for the sourness or the tartness, as well as the structure in wine. Malic acid is present in lower quantities and is mostly associated with green apples and is converted to lactic acid by malolactic conversion, which resembles a softer acidity, like that found in yogurt. When matching acidity in wine with food, foods with a very high acidity can compete with the wine and thereby dominating it, making the wine appear flat or flabby. Acidity is a very important variable to consider when working on pairings due to the complex manner in which the acidity can amplify flavors in a dish. Think about what a simple squeeze of lemon can do to an oyster. Wines with a good acidity pair well with foods that are fatty, rich, or salty. The acidity can bring freshness to the experience and can bring a refreshing break to the palate. In the wine industry, we will say something along the lines of the acidity of the wine cuts through the richness of the food. Acidic or tart, which is another wine descriptor for acidity, normally pair well with tart or acidic dishes as well. An important thing to keep in mind here is the balance, because you don't want the acidity of the food to overwhelm the wine and make it seem flat or flabby, but you also don't want the acidity of the wine to overwhelm the acidity in the food. So you might think that tart and tart will result in super tart, but in actual fact, these two elements can downplay each other and can highlight the other flavors in the food and wine profile. So to come back to that question from earlier, do you think a super taster would prefer a wine like a Pinot Noir or a Cabernet Sauvignon? So if you are a super taster and you're very sensitive to bitter tastes, you'll be more likely to enjoy a lighter bodied red wine with a softer tannin structure. So something along the lines of a Pinot Noir rather than a full-bodied tannic Cabernet Sauvignon. Tannins in wine are not tasted, but are sensorially perceived or measured. They account for the mouth-puckering effect and a bitterness that a wine has, similar to when you drink strong black tea. Have you ever wondered how or why this happens? Well, it's all due to proteins. Your saliva contains proteins, and tannins react with these. This reaction results in the drying out effect that leaves you feel like your lips are sticking to your teeth. Tannins are valuable in wine for structure and body, and are especially important when wine is made with the intention for bottle aging. To recap from an earlier lesson, some terms that we use to describe tannins are grippy, chalky, silky, soft, big, or bold. We know that tannins come from grape skins, seeds, and stems, as well as oak vessels. We also know that tannins will readily react with proteins, so we can see something forming here naturally. So it will be safe to say that wines that are high in tannin will react readily with foods that are protein rich or high in fat. Examples here are red meat and hard cheese like Parmesan. The tannins in the wine will bind with the proteins and come across as softer. We know that the impact that oak has on wine can be significant, and it can add to the structure, aroma, and flavor profile of a wine. Oak contributes tannins to the wine as well as aroma and flavor compounds. Depending on certain variables, such as the age of the barrel and the seasoning thereof, the intensity of the impact that it has on a wine will be different. When looking at how to pair wine with food, the impact of oak needs to be taken into consideration. For example, a red wine that has spent time in an American oak vessel might have developed a characteristic aroma and flavor of vanilla due to the vanillins. This will be an important element to think about when pairing that particular wine with food. The two types of sugars that are found in wine are glucose and fructose. Sugar tastes sweet, as we know, and in wine, fructose tastes sweeter than glucose. Humans are not as sensitive to picking up sweetness when compared to acidity or bitterness, and sweetness or sugar can very easily be masked in wine with acidity. Like we have learned, when evaluating a wine sensorially, it takes practice and training to evaluate the separate components in wine, and importantly, we constantly have to consider how these components interact with each other. A wine can have a high residual sugar as well as a very high acidity, and could therefore be perceived as dry, even though there is sugar present. Alcohol is one of the main elements that will define a wine's body and weight. We have made the link between the relationship between alcohol and body in this course so far. The higher the alcohol, the bigger the body. Oftentimes, when a wine has a high alcohol, it can be described as hot. Hot meaning that it leaves a burning sensation of alcohol burn once you've swallowed the wine. If you have ever had a shot of spirits, then you might know the sensation that I'm describing. With the hotness of wine in mind, high alcohol wines can amplify the presence of heat or spice in food, and vice versa. So, pairing high alcohol wines with spicy food will be a congruent pairing as they share similar flavor compounds, and this pairing will boost the heat sensation on the palate. Before we go any further, allow me to tell you about what's coming up in your next lesson. In the next lesson, we are going to look at specific food and wine pairing examples, including regional classics, congruent and complementary matches. We will also dive a little bit deeper into the technicalities of food and wine pairing, which is a science as well as an art. When pairing wine with food, think about the wine as an additional ingredient that will add to the collective sensorial experience of the dish. So you are shifting your view of the wine simply being the beverage that is served with food and seeing it as a cohesive part of the gastronomic experience. So when you're looking at that bottle of Pinot Grigio, you're not seeing Pinot Grigio, but rather a dry, light-bodied wine with a lower alcohol, a high acidity, and no tannins, and this will form the basis of your pairing. A good guide to follow when figuring out when to pair wine with certain foods is to consider regional pairings. For example, the fact that Italian red wine like Sangiovese pairs beautifully with Italian tomato-based dishes like pasta or pizza. So, when in doubt, remember, those that grow together normally go together. The world is changing faster than we realize, and statistically, the job you'll do in the future is most likely not the same job you originally qualified for. In order to future-proof your career, you need to strive to constantly update and diversify your skill set. We are in the digital age and are at the point in history where higher education is no longer available for an elite few. Here at Shaw Academy, we truly believe that our students can build their own credentials, design their own learning, and develop a multitude of skills. The combination of salt with sweet certainly is not only dangerously Moorish, but kind of genius. Bringing food and wine together in this way can truly result in a flavor bomb. The purpose of using salt in food is to enhance flavors. A pinch of salt can uplift and elevate a dish to the next level, but too much salt can kill a dish in an instant. Salt can also really impact the sensorial experience of a wine. For complementary pairing with salt, pair salty foods either with a dry sparkling wine or a wine that has a high acidity. If you are thinking of contrasting with salt, think about a zingy Riesling with a residual sugar paired with a salty umami Asian dish. In this type of pairing, you are contrasting the salt in the dish with the sweetness of the wine. Acidity is probably the default characteristic in wine that people look at when considering pairings. Acidity is an element in wine that you would complement with acidity in food instead of trying to contrast. Although there is a very fine line here of the one being able to overwhelm the other. So, a guideline is when pairing acidic food with wine, the acidity of the wine needs to be equal to or greater than the acidity of the food. Otherwise, the wine will simply fall flat. For example, a meal that is quite acidic, like a salad with a balsamic vinegar dressing paired with a wine that has a low acidity, will just not work. The acidity in the dish will overwhelm the acidity in the wine, and the wine will taste flat, flabby, and completely out of balance. In the case of acidic dishes, you're looking for a wine with a solid acidity, and this way, both the food and the wine will be amplified. Steak and red wine is a classic pairing, and it works because tannins seek fat. Not only does this pairing taste good, but it actually feels good too. Research done on the science of how we taste has shown when we eat fatty or greasy foods, our saliva glands get to work and start to over-salivate and produce proteins in the saliva. This is done to help lubricate our mouths. These foods can actually leave a very fatty or oily sensation on the palate. So, when we take a sip of red wine with punchy tannins, these tannins actually bind to the proteins, pulling them out of the mouth and relieving that fatty or oily feeling that's left behind. Acidity also brings relief in these scenarios by cutting through the fattiness. The solution to everything is butter and champagne, or maybe it's both. If you have a dish that's very rich, like something that's cheese-based or very buttery and butter-based, there's nothing like a fresh and zingy bubbly to cut through the richness. Just think about the classic French butter and white wine sauce. The acid in the wine just elevates and lifts the sauce completely. When it comes to sweetness, a good rule of thumb is to make sure that the wine is sweeter than the food. If it is the other way around, the sweetness in the food will cause the wine to lose its character completely, and it will appear lifeless and flat. Sweet foods have the ability to enhance bitterness that may be present in wine. So this is something to be mindful of. If you have ever had a sweet cup of coffee and then a piece of dark chocolate right after, and you found that chocolate to be extra bitter, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. So be careful to pair sweet foods with wines that are highly astringent or bitter. When it comes to spicy foods, there is so much diversity for pairing options. One can go complementary or congruent. Spicy foods have the ability to highlight bitter and acid components in wine, but can soften the body or sweetness of a wine. This is why Riesling with a little bit of residual sugar normally is the go-to wine with spicy foods. Some top tips for food and wine pairing are: keep the preference of your guests in mind when pairing food and wine. There's no point in you putting together an amazing meal and pairing it with a wine that nobody really likes. Look for pairings that complement each other in weight and body. For example, if the dish is light and bright, you should be looking at a lighter bodied wine. Next is don't forget the sauce. Oftentimes, the sauce of the dish is what carries the dish and ties things together. So when you are working with a pairing, seek synergy between the sauce and the wine. But if there's no sauce, go with the protein or the main ingredient. Pair the wine with the food. It is so much easier to have the profile of the food form the basis of what you will pair it with instead of the other way around. The only no-no would be complementing bitter foods with bitter tannic wines, as this will just create a super bitter experience and will not be pleasant. Instead, try to lift the bitter elements in the food with some fruit, sweetness, or acidity characters in wine. And lastly, And definitely the most important tip I have for you today is have fun and be creative, because after all, food and wine are meant to be enjoyed. I'd like to take a moment to reiterate that taste is subjective and we all perceive things differently. Food and wine pairing is part science and part art, so a pairing might work for some, but not all people. It all depends on what your preferences are. At the end of the day, food and wine are there to bring people together, to tell stories, and most importantly, to be enjoyed. Dark chocolate with red wine is quite a popular pairing, but some argue that bitter and bitter do not work together. I'd like you for today's challenge to go and try this pairing at home. Get yourself a red wine that you know is packing a lot of tannins and pair it with a dark chocolate. And let us know why you agree with this pairing or not. Remember to use the hashtag #SureWine and tell us about your experience in either pictures or in words. We'd love to see what you're up to. So let's take a moment to take a look at the 5 main skills that you are developing in this course. Firstly, tasting, including wine tasting, palate development, and identification and evaluation of wine faults. Next, we are learning to navigate the wine bottle, careers and terminology in the wine industry, as well as the elements of wine service. In the viticulture and oenology department, we have learnt about primary alcoholic fermentation, secondary fermentation and maturation, as well as viticultural practices. We have learned about the principal wine styles, principal grape cultivars or varieties, and food and wine pairing. And in the next lesson, we'll get in a little bit deeper. Lastly, we are going to study the wines of the world, including Old World wines, New World wines, and innovation in the wine industry. This is just the tip of the iceberg. As in wine, one really never stops learning. As in anything, but especially in wine, I believe, one learns best by doing. So keep on tasting and documenting your journey. Thank you for joining me for this lesson today. I really hope you enjoyed it and are excited to apply what you have learned in this lesson at home. In the next lesson, we'll be diving deeper into food and wine pairing with some examples that you can try. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon for lesson 6.